All right, I think we should get started. Good evening, everybody. I'm Charles Bacos. I'm a thoracic surgeon, and I'm a member of the Eastern Cardiothoracic Surgical Society. It's our pleasure this evening, this afternoon, if you're on the West Coast, to have our first webinar on contract negotiation for physicians and CT surgeons in particular. It's really my pleasure to introduce the panelists. I will start with Mr. Kyle Clausen, who is a lawyer and who is the CEO of Resolve. Has been an advocate for physicians in their compensation and employment contract for the last decade or so. It's no surprise he's married to an ophthalmologist. I would also like to introduce Dr. Derek Serna-Gallegos, who is assistant professor of cardiothoracic surgery at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Dr. Gallegos did graduate in 2020, and he does have clinical interest in aortic surgery, has also been an advocate for physician negotiation and compensation. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Dr. Afshin Hassan, who is a cardiothoracic surgeon at Brown in Rhode Island, and the director of minimally invasive cardiac surgery, who's joining us today as a moderator. So a couple of housekeeping items. First, we will start with Kyle giving his talk on contract negotiation. It will be a broad talk. Then we'll leave the floor to Dr. Serna-Gallegos or Derek to give his perspective, if I may say, or his view from as a relatively young early career attending. And obviously, we'll ask the audience to ask questions in the Q&A chat box. We will address all of them as long as the time permits. So without further ado, Kyle, the floor is yours.
I appreciate that. Thanks for the introduction. And I'm going to echo what was just said. If you guys have questions, feel free to use the chat functionality, the Q&A, even as we go through this, you don't, forget what the question was by the time we get there at the end. So I want to give you my perspective. So I am an attorney. We work with physicians across the country in all specialties. We have a really broad view of the market. And so what I think is interesting to think about is just with the change in physician employment over the last decade, but really accelerating in the last 5 years or so. Understanding where your value is going to be quantified, right? Just like of Patrick Mahomes gets a new contract, they're attempting to define his value to the Chiefs. If you're a football fan, your contract is going to do its best to define what your value is to your organization. Now, I don't think they're perfect. I don't think the contract and compensation directly, correlates always to that value that you're bringing, but it's the tool that we've got right today. And so I think it's behooves you to do a good job of understanding what your contract says, what the value points are, what the risk looks like. And so when you think about the market for physicians today and what you're likely going to be looking at, if you're in training and leaving, or if you're just mid-career, shifting from one job to the next, I think it's important to understand who the players are in the field. With that shift towards employment, private practice is not dead, but it's certainly a minority player right at this point. Most of your contracts are going to be coming from either a hospital or a health system, an academic center, or potentially a practice that's owned at some level with private equity. And contractually, what that means is that you're going to see very different things out of those different organizations, different comp models, different guarantee amounts, different potential upside if you're in private practice, having different autonomy levels, different ancillary revenue streams. And so as you look at this chart, your goal is obviously not to be bottom left. You don't want to have low guarantees, low benefit packages and things like that, and also giving up control and giving up some of that ancillary revenue versus trying to get yourself in the top right to have the best of all worlds if you can. And so my suggestion for you guys on strategy, right, on how do you go about doing that, is I think these 4 things are really, really important. And that's what we're going to spend most of our time on, is 1, identifying your priorities. When physicians are surveyed, it's still primarily what they care about most is geography when selecting a position. Then it's time, right, and kind of work, call schedules, locations, things like that. And then finally, it's compensation. That's usually number three. And so we're not going to talk about how you prioritize personally. That's up to you guys. But I do think it's helpful to understand that and to have you think through that process before you get to your contract. What I do want to focus on tonight is understanding value and risk in a contract, what terms you should be thinking about. It's not all about compensation. There's other things that have a lot of value tied into them. Where to review market data. How do you know what's fair in a contract, what you should be comparing that to, where to find that data. And then finally, we're going to talk about negotiations, encouraging you to do that in good faith, and understanding that you may not always get a lot of transparency and good faith back from your employer. Okay. So let's start with what you should be thinking about in a contract. How do you define value? What are the risk points? This is not intended to be an all-encompassing list for you, but it's a pretty good snapshot of the big things, right, that you should be paying attention to. And so I like to think about things in categories of three. The first major category for me is anything that touches on your duties and your responsibilities. So this would be column one. Things like, where do I work? When do I work? How much call am I taking, right? First and foremost. When we have clients come to us and they're transitioning from one job to the next and they talk about broken promises, it's almost always in this category. It's almost always, they told me call was whatever, 1 in 4, and it ended up being 1 in 3. Or they told me I'd only be at one hospital and then I got moved around to 2 or 3. So getting this part right, it has a lot of value for our clients. The second thing that falls into this category would be outside activities. So if you have any interest in moonlighting, side gigs, intellectual property development, the contract needs to discuss what is going to happen in that situation. Do you, one, have the ability to do that with or without consent? Do you get to retain the ownership on those items or not? Okay. And so if it's not done well, it's likely going to be a very broad brush for the employer saying that you can't do that unless they give their permission. Okay. And then finally, if there's any supervision issues, right, with APPs, if there's any time allocations that you need specifically for research or admin time, all of that should be factoring into what I'm going to call your duties, responsibilities, and kind of scope of what you're being hired to do. Okay. So that's kind of value category number one. Value category number two, anything that touches on comp, right? And that's maybe what people think of first in contract negotiation and contract value, but you need to understand your comp model. Okay. Meaning, is it just a base? Is it just production? Is it some combination of both of those things? Most contracts are going to have some combination of guaranteed salary plus production. Production models vary. We're going to talk about what those look like in a minute. Usually either a work RVU model, a collection model, or a gross charges model. That's 95% of the comp plans that are out there. There has been discussion, right? Especially recently about quality components. And there are some organizations that have rolled in quality as a component of your compensation. Usually it's less than 10% of the total comp being offered. Some organizations don't touch on it at all, but I do think that's something to be careful on and to pay attention to. A lot of times those are subjective things or objective measures that you don't necessarily have full control over. Okay. So we're going to go through some examples on base and production and how organizations sometimes play games with that and how to determine if it's fair in a minute. But if you're in a position where there's high demand for your service or it's a vacancy that's been there for a long time, you're likely to see other things as well: signing bonuses, relocation allowance, potentially student loan forgiveness or stipends if you're in training, depending on how early you sign, along with all the other traditional benefits like CME, vacation time, things like that. There are certain benefits that are non-negotiable, and I think it's important to know that before you go into a negotiation. Things like retirement plans, health insurance, right? You think about a 401k, those are benefits that they've locked in with a third party. So meaning Fidelity might manage their 401k, for example, or 403b. They can't change the terms of that for one person coming in, right? They have to make elections for everyone at the same time. So you can not like those plans. You may think that one employer has better health insurance than the other. You're not going to be able to change that. So you need to focus on other areas of the comp package to make yourself whole on those. Okay. And then finally, the third category of things that have value and risk at the same time, anything that touches on termination. So you need to know how the contract can end, for cause and without cause. You need to know how to deliver that notice if you need to get out of a contract. You have to absolutely understand the next two, which are tail coverage and non-competes. We're going to talk about non-competes here in a second and the value that those have. But if you're not familiar with non-competes, basically what it says is you're not allowed to go to work for a certain amount of time in a certain area if this contract ends. right? That's bad for you. Okay. On the tail coverage side, malpractice insurance, big benefit that they're going to be providing for you, but you have to know who pays for tail coverage post termination. Tail coverage is needed because patients can sue for a statute of limitations, right? It's not just while you're employed. If you go from employer A to employer B, right, and a patient from employer A files a suit, the insurance policy from employer A needs to cover that, and or you need to have tail. So understanding the cost on that and who's paying for it is really, really important. And then finally, some of these other things I'm going to call smaller things. If you took signing bonuses, relocation allowances, you need to know how long you have to stay before those aren't subject to repayment. Most of those are going to come with kind of that golden handcuff feature where you need to stay 2 or 3 or 4 years to fully have that earned. So understanding that, understanding if there's any type of liquidated damage for violating a non-compete. What liquidated damages means is there's an automatic calculation or an automatic damage amount plugged into the document. So if you violate the non-compete, we don't even have to prove that we were damaged. It's just here's the $250,000 that you owe us, right? Or 300,000 or 1 year's salary, whatever it is, right? These numbers really vary. That's obviously, again, not good for you in most situations. And then finally, the last one on this list is the force majeure clause. That is a relatively new feature. That's kind of a post-COVID employment contract term that basically says if there's any act of God, that the parties aren't subject to following through on the contract. Historically, in the legal world, we saw these for construction contracts, right? So if a home builder is putting a house up in Florida, a hurricane comes through and wipes it out, they're not subject to a breach of contract action by the homeowner. How we saw organizations run into problems with that is during COVID. Obviously, there was a lot of furloughing and comp cuts and reallocation from a scope standpoint. Those employers were usually in breach of contract, and so now they've started to insert this clause, into the documents in case there's another pandemic, that they're allowed to essentially not uphold the agreement. So I think you just need to be careful on that. There's obviously things that happen, right? We're not saying that that's not maybe a need for an organization, but you should have some notice on it. It shouldn't just be a tomorrow your pay gets cut in half, right? Type of policy. So if you can, hit on these items, right? I mean, these are going to be the big things that have a lot of effect. Again, there's certainly some other things that may be important for your individual situations, and we're happy to talk on that. But what I want to go to next is just how organizations sometimes play games with comp models and where there's margin, right, for negotiation. And so I just want to walk you through a sample analysis on a work RVU model. The same type of thought process can go into a collection model and a billings model. But for example purposes, if you have a contract being offered to you with a base salary of 200, production threshold of 3,000 work RVUs, and a conversion factor multiplier of $40. I know your specialty, the numbers are much bigger than this, but just for example purposes. And then you go and check the data sources, right? And the data says median comp is also 200. And so you think, great, I'm being paid at median, which is, what you would expect at least, right? If not more. But then you also go and check the number of work RVUs that most of your colleagues are producing to get to that same level. And that number is 2,500. Okay. So what that should be telling you, and what you should be thinking about, is I'm being asked to produce in my contract an extra 500 work RVUs without any additional compensation, as opposed to my peers, right? And so if every work RVU is worth $40, 40 times that 500 gap is $20,000 of income that you're not receiving, as opposed to your peers that would be, right? And that's what the market tells us is fair market value. So if there's gaps between, right, a base number and a threshold, or if there's a gap between a multiplier being at 40 when maybe it should be 60, right, for this area, those are the ways that we see organizations try to recruit and retain with guaranteed numbers, but then ultimately having margin and having, right, some organizational profit on the back end if somebody's really productive. So I think you just have to be careful on that. You need to know what that analysis looks like, and you need to make sure that if I produce at current levels, and if I also produce at levels that are higher, down the road, that my comp is still fair, because the contracts are likely set up for 2, 3, 4 year, right, terms at a time. And so you just want to be careful on that. Okay. The next thing that I want to give you an example on is non-competes and just the value of non-competes. There's obviously a heavy discussion right now with the FTC. Maybe they're getting rid of them across the country. Maybe they're not. It got delayed for a year, so we're still waiting on that discussion. There are some states that have wiped out non-competes, but the majority rule right now is if they're reasonable, they can be enforced. And so that should be your default framework and your default thinking on this. Non-competes, essentially, again, for those of you unfamiliar, say you can't work in a certain area for a certain amount of time post-termination. And so on my little picture here, with the expansion of health systems and the expansions of, multi-location organizations, if you've got a 10-mile non-compete, but there's actually 6 or 7 circles on the map, right, it's going to wipe out a pretty big area. And what that does to a market is it removes competition. And when competition is removed from a market, right, it tends to start to look monopolistic, or there's some, price fixing type things that happen. The FTC thinks, this is not me, the FTC thinks that in some markets where there's a lack of competition for physicians because of non-competes, that physician comp is being suppressed by 37%. That's a big number. So on average physician compensation, that's about $111,000 a year. Again, for your specialty, it'd be much higher than that. And that equates to about $9.3 million over a career, right, of your earnings. So agreeing to a non-compete and signing a non-compete, especially if it's overly broad and it doesn't leave you many options, is going to be a extremely highly valuable point to you in the contract. And you need to understand that if that's in there, you may need to get and extract value in other areas to make sure you're being treated fairly. Okay. All right. So with that,
there's a question in the chat. Do you mind? While
sure.
we're on the topic of non-competes, it says,
yeah,
comment on fair/reasonable non-compete mileage and time period.
Yeah. So when you look at these kind of 4 buckets over here, the time, restricted area, and scope, all of those need to be reasonable. And what's reasonable in, I think the questions on New York City, what's reasonable in New York City is going to be very different than what's in the middle of Kansas, right? And so they're all based on population density and kind of draw areas of the practice or the organization that you're with. And so in New York, you'd expect them to be very small, like a mile would be a lot, right? Sometimes in New York, we see them defined by blocks, even of where you can't go to work later on, versus if you're in Kansas, right, a rural area, just in general, they can be 50, 100 miles sometimes, and that actually makes sense because there's nowhere else to go, right, within that 50-mile radius. So I think, again, in New York, there's discussions around getting rid of that, but I don't think anything has been done at this point in time. So I think you just need to be careful when you sign that and try to reduce it for yourself as much as possible. We see carve-outs for academics sometimes. We see carve-outs for going into solo practice sometimes. We'll see carve-outs for how the contract terminates, right? If you let me go for no reason, you waive it. We see carve-outs for mergers, acquisitions, right? If a health system comes in and buys you out, I should have the choice of, do I want to go somewhere else or not? So I think even if you let the organization keep the non-compete, you can still carve some holes in it to give yourself options and outs as well. So really good question and a really, really big value point. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, hopefully you've spotted all the issues, right? You've gone through this, you've gone through your contract, you know what to look out for. You still have to know now, how do I know what's fair, right? So your question right there was perfect. How do I know what's a normal non-compete? What does that look like? Again, there's 3 categories of data that I'd have you think about. The first one is what I'm going to call survey data. So you may have heard of acronyms like MGMA or others, Sullivan-Cotter, AAMC, right? There's a handful of them that are out there. Most of the institutions are going to reference one or more of those. They may blend some of that together, but you have to have access to it, is my point. You have to have at least access to one of these surveys to know what is typical for conversion factors according to the employers, to know what call rates look like, all of that stuff, right, is in this data set. So that's data set number 1. Those come out about once a year, usually May, June-ish. And so we're getting close to having that reset right now. But they're important because employers use those for fair market value compliance purposes to avoid the anti-kickback and the Stark rules and the IRS regulations. And so if they're good for that purpose, right, they're also going to need to be good for your purpose of making sure you're at fair value. Okay. The second one is data like what we have on our site. So we utilize not only MGMA when we're doing analysis, but we also use verified contracts from your peers. So if we know that there's other organizations in New York or California or elsewhere, based on the contracts that we've seen, right, that data is available to you. It's anonymous, it's de-identified. You're not going to know whose information it is. but you can go through and see what other non-competes look like in your state. You can go through and see what other comp models look like in your state or your location. And I think that's really helpful. And that information's live, right? It's not a year old. Your third data set, and I think your best data set, better than ours, better than any survey, is to have other job offers for yourself in your hand at a certain period of time, right? So we can all guess at what you should make in Denver, right? But if you have 3 job offers in Denver right now, you're going to know, right, what those organizations offer, not only in comp, but also non-competes, tail, all that stuff. So my recommendation to you, if you're going through this process, utilize all 3, right? Get access to all of it, because the more you can get together, the better picture you're going to be able to paint for yourself. And the reason that's important is because this stuff varies a lot. Okay, so when we talk about surveys, there's over 50 data points just within the MGMA surveys. There's over 233 filters on that. So if somebody tells you that this is the median, that's a very loaded statement, right? You don't know the median on what data point exactly, what filters have been pulled to get there. Within the same specialty, just on the contracts that we see, there's ranges in guaranteed comp from the low end of 375 to 1.6 million in your specialty. Signing bonuses from 0 to 150, relocation from 0 to 20. Okay. And so if a survey comes out and says the median comp is 500, or the median signing bonus is 20,000, right? That doesn't mean that that's the only data set you should be looking at and treating as what the market's going to give you. Okay. The other thing that I would tell you is that trend information is important. So your contract is going to be forward facing. It's not going to be on last year's data or the year before, but you do want to have a decent idea of what that trend looks like. So, work RVUs for your specialty over the last 5 years, comp per work RVU is up 16%, total comp's up 17, and total encounters are up 13. And so knowing kind of where your specialty is going, I think has a lot of value when you're in a negotiation. Okay. So get your hands on as much data as you can. Last topic, before we get to other questions and other just discussions, is if you've spotted every issue and you've compared it and you know that there's spots that need to be negotiated, you need to decide if you're taking that next step, right? Am I actually going to go through and ask for these things to be done or not? My suggestion for you is to be prepared for 2 things. The first thing is every employer, regardless of size, is going to tell you that this is our standard contract and we never change it, right? From where we sit, we have a very, again, unique vantage point on this. That's relatively a false statement. Roughly 85% of the contracts that we see have adjustments to them. The sample little snippet there is language I took from an email from an employer to us, just to give you an example of how this looks. We don't change our contract. It's been vetted by attorneys for 15 years. And then that said, we are going to change our non-compete for this position because it was really, really important for them to sign, right, the contract. And so when we see things like that, you can know that, well, if they're changing it for one, they're obviously making, or they're open to making adjustments for everybody else too. Okay. The other thing I would tell you is make sure the reason I think data is so important and to have comps for yourself is so important is because you're not always going to get transparency from these employers back. This is again another snippet talking about why they believe their number is the right number. They confirm with their fair market value company. They used a couple surveys. We can't give you the analysis back on this. We can't share that with you, but you just have to trust us that, we really want you to work here and our offer's fair. Okay. And so that again is not that helpful in a negotiation, but I do think you need to know if that's the way they're going to come back, what's your alternative, right? What if they say no to everything or no to the most important parts for you? Your BATNA, kind of having that best alternative available and knowing what that looks like ahead of time is really important. And then finally deciding, is this something you can do on your own or do you need help, right, at some level? And not everybody does. So I don't want to come across saying you have to have, an attorney or somebody outside help you with these things. But I do think you need to be careful, right? Your contracts have an extremely high value, especially in your specialty. And so if it's a 2, 3, 4 year miss, right, on your part, especially on comp, that's going to equate to a really big number. So that's what we have tried to create and what we do. We've created tools for you guys to help extract that value. If you need access to that survey data that we talked about, you can get snapshots like this on the site. You don't have to, go through and have an attorney review a contract. If you're just monitoring kind of your career, that's there for you. If you need to see contract information from your peers, right? You can hop in, drill down on a specific contract and see what the vacation was, see what the tail policy looked like, see what the non-compete is. And then finally, if you just want to score your contract. So the question before on what's a normal non-compete, there's a calculator here for you, a scorecard. You can hop in and say, hey, I live in a major metro. I've got a 10-mile non-compete. We'll tell you if we think it's okay, if we think it's average, or if we think it needs to be negotiated. Okay. So there's tools out there for you. Again, that's what we do. And so that's why we're here to answer questions on that stuff. If there are questions you don't feel like putting in the Q&A, because sometimes people don't want to do that, my email's on here. I'm happy to answer those offline as well. So with that, I will turn it over.
Great, Kyle. This was an excellent talk. Obviously, a very broad but overall comprehensive overview of many issues at stake for physician contracts. There's a question from the audience, but before I get there, I'd like to briefly introduce this kind of a surprise. Dr. Faiz Bora, who is a colleague and a friend, who I was hoping for him to join today to give us his perspective a little bit from a senior level, if I may say that. He is currently the regional chair of surgery at the Hackensack Meridian Health System and chief of thoracic surgery. I know he's a bit short on time, but I would like to give the floor to Dr. Sherna-Gallegos and Dr. Bora to give their perspective, if I may say, from young and technical perspective and from a senior level. Dr. Bora did negotiate many contracts throughout his career. You have a few minutes, Faiz, or you have to
Yeah, I do. Thank you very much. In fact, I was just negotiating one with my leadership about an hour ago, and I appreciate, Carl. I think that's a very high level and informative summary. I'll just make a few points here. I think you've gone into some nitty-gritty as well, and you've kind of broken down the important elements of a contract quite well. I'll tell you that at the end of the day, a lot of things in your contract really, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 things, are sort of the fluff around the edges, right? I think the most important thing is what is going to be your comp, your total comp. When you're starting out, my strong recommendation is look not just for the amount, but what the guaranteed comp is going to be. Ideally, you should have some level of guaranteed comp in your first job, typically for at least 2 years, but ideally for 3 years. So that's number 1. 2, if you have an upside production bonus, that can be a double-edged sword. When you're working in a group model, if someone is chasing RVUs, it's generally going to come at the expense of another partner. So you have to be a little bit careful when your comp is very heavily production-based. 3, the other quality and incentive bonuses, as has been mentioned by Carl, are small, about 10 or 15%, and usually are developed every year. So you may not have access to that data or what the expectation is going to be. I think the non-compete is important. As a junior faculty just starting out, I'll tell you that you're not going to have a lot of leverage with a non-compete, except if you're in a rural area where it's been hard to recruit and there are a whole set of other circumstances. But I would typically not budge on a non-compete because our non-competes are very fair, I think. I am, by the way, completely against non-competes. If it were up to me, and I've raised this issue many times. In fact, I'll throw this question at you, Carl. Why are attorneys the only profession that are exempt from non-competes? Maybe you can help me answer this question at the end. But it is the only profession that I know of where the non-compete doesn't apply. So our non-compete is typically 10 miles for 1 year in New Jersey. And as Carl has said, it does vary. Manhattan is typically 1 mile for 1 or 2 years. Connecticut is about 20 miles for 2 years. Some of these meet state laws. So a health system may just implement what the state law is for the non-compete. If you're an innovator, the intellectual property clauses become important. And I'm happy to give a whole talk on that. I think it's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular talk. But to me, that's a very important piece. I managed to negotiate a lot of that out of my contracts, and for good reason. So I'll stop there, and I'll let you guys ask me any questions or go on. But I'll just say that in your first job, what you should really try and negotiate is your base salary up. I think most people will give a little bit if you're on the lower side of the spectrum. So knowing the data is important. Asking your friends and colleagues what they've been offered perhaps is helpful. I think, as Carl said, if you have 2 or 3 offers in the same city, that's great. That's an unusual situation. That's rare that you're going to have that level of data to play one health system off the other. But if you do, that's great. So I think trying to negotiate your base up a little bit. I think you can certainly ask for more in your relocation, and you can ask for a little bit more in your sign-on bonus. Those are areas where we will give fairly easily, and I will go to bat for my new recruits to try and get them as much as possible.
Great. Thank you so much for the inputs. You brought up multiple points, Dr. Bora. As you alluded to, I mean, the negotiating power of a young surgeon or somebody out of fellowship is not the same as somebody who's maybe mid-level or even more senior or in a chair position. I'd like to leave the floor now to Dr. Serna Gallegos. Derek, you're the young surgeon among the panelists, not that we're old, but if you want to give us your perspective, what you were able yourself to negotiate in your first or second contract, and you're 4 years out now already. You're on mute, Derek, though. We still can't hear you. I'm not sure. Unless it's me only. While Derek is trying to figure out his audio, Faiz, I've heard of some surgeon being able to negotiate a home loan in their initial package. As you probably know, I mean, that's, I mean, it's something that's feasible. It may give the institution the impression and the belief that this surgeon is willing to stick around. How much, what's been your experience? Have you seen this happen? Or maybe Kyle, you can chime in as well.
Yeah, I'll let Kyle answer that, and then I'll give you my 2 cents.
So we've seen, I mean, some organizations will give housing, right, or down payment assistance on a house. Usually that I view that as the same as a large signing bonus, really, right? I mean, it's going to be taxable income to you. It's going to be tied to multiple years, right, of forgiveness, and so I think you'll want to be very careful on that. I think ultimately it just comes down to whether or not you think that cash is best used in a house. I've rarely seen organizations mandate that it goes to that bucket. It's more of this is what it's intended for, kind of like relocation. Sometimes relocation amounts are framed that way, but they don't actually force you to turn in receipts. It's just additional, compensation up front. So I think it's possible. I think they're there. I think it's just another way to frame the negotiation.
I have a question for you, Carl. Are there any fair market rules or anti-kickback rules that apply to a big sign-on bonus? I know that. Yep. I know that it feeds on to your initial cost, but other than that, could one offer someone $500,000 as a sign-on and be immune from regulatory issues?
So when you look at the regulatory issues, it's what's fair and also what's commercially reasonable, right? Those are the 2 prongs that you have to look at. And so if it's a $500,000 loan, right, an example that you just gave, and if it's over 10 years, the way that the government would look at that is it's really 50,000 per year, right, of additional total comp, because that's what's going to be taxable and that's what's forgiven every year. So you also usually get more leeway around the initial recruitment than you do on someone who's been there and producing, because it's all guesswork, right, on that first contract, because you don't know what their production is going to look like. All you know is that it's been hard to fill, and if we're giving out an incentive like that, we know that obviously there's high demand there. So there's nothing, and CMS has even come out and said this, that there's historically been this thought process of we can't go past the 75th percentile, because if we do that, we're in violation of fair market value. Even the government has come out and said that that's not true, right? Some situations the median might be right, some situations the 90th percentile might be right. And so I think if we're talking about this issue, it's usually in a situation where there's high demand.
I'll just add that in most organizations, once you go above the 75th percentile, there's an additional review process. So for us, it goes on to the executive committee of the hospital. So it might delay things because they meet once a month or once every other month, but there is an additional review that happens if you're above the 75th percentile.
Great, thank you for the question. There's one question in the chat box, but before we get there, Derek, I think you're good now with your audio.
Yeah, can you guys hear me now?
Yes, we're good. Go ahead.
Yeah, I apologize about that. So I think, I'm just going to start off a little bit by just talking about what my situation was and the kind of lack of leverage I had, and give you a little perspective of my situation. So I did a 2-year fellowship here at University of Pittsburgh, and I was in line to do an aortic fellowship, do a 3rd year here. Then kind of and it was about March or April of the year I was going to graduate. The last couple months of my fellowship, the surgeon I was supposed to do the fellowship with left. And so at that point, I was kind of in a situation where, it was too late to apply for other fellowships. And it was pretty late to start applying for jobs. But that's what I decided to do, is start applying for jobs. And so I was kind of looking around, different places in the country. And what ended up happening was I ended up having a position here with that surgeon leaving. And so I stayed on. But at the time, I really had no leverage because, I didn't have these other contracts, like things that we're talking about. And they knew basically that I was looking for a job. And I think, my kind of thought process was it was a good opportunity because there was going to be a good clinical volume of cases. And, I got what I think is just below what would probably have been, market value, but not egregious. And so I saw it as an opportunity, one, to kind of get, my clinical skills, bring them up to snuff, and then kind of work for things from there. So I think one of the things that's important for early surgeons to realize is, it is a longer game than your first contract, right? So we've had fellows that have gone out and kind of chased a big income in a situation that didn't have good mentoring or something like that, and wasn't a good long-term option. And there are, negatives to that also. So I think, when you're coming out, you really want to see it as kind of the long game. And even if the contract isn't necessarily perfect, if it provides an ability for you to get the skills that you need for later contracts, I do think that is important. I think, Kyle and everybody's done a great job just kind of outlining all these things that are important for your contracts. And I think, as you guys see, negotiating contracts when you're a senior surgeon or a middle-aged surgeon who's already proven your worth and have a reputation is different than when you're coming out. And really one of the most important things is not only your compensation, things like that, but establishing your skills, establishing your own reputation, so that those next contracts down the line, you can have them. I think trying to negotiate a high RVU goal, I think also could be problematic because if you're trying to chase high compensation, and I do think if you have to be either below or above your RVU goal, especially early on, it's better to overperform, and with the thought that down the line you can negotiate again.
I think all excellent points. I particularly wanted to highlight again what you said about what I think is the most important thing you should look for in your first job, and again, a little bit outside the scope of this, and that is your mentor. And the second thing is your mentor, and the third thing is your mentor. You really want your first 2 or 3 years to be mortality free, to build a reputation for reliability and for being a solid surgeon and physician. So absolutely most important thing, once that piece is in place, then I think, looking at all the other angles that we're talking about becomes important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll just add quickly, Dr. Bohra will be part of the webinar on early career success, the most important criteria for your first job, no doubt about it. But excellent point again made by Derek and Fez. Yeah, if Kyle or anybody would like to chime in and maybe give their input on non-monetary value besides obviously the mentorship, whether and we talked about intellectual property, which I think is a little bit of a niche negotiation, but something that gets overlooked, I do believe, for young fellows and surgeons when they negotiate is things such as access to the OR time. It tends not to be typically written in clear wording, I think, in contract. Similarly, vacation time, whether paternity leave or maternity leaves, and sick time. Can somebody comment on that?
I can.
George, can I?
Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Carl another question while he answers this. Carl, would you also and your firm be the ones perhaps negotiating for a new surgeon? So rather than the surgeon going back and forth, do you have any experience with that? I have not typically, I just have the surgeons kind of talk directly to the chairs, and the pros and cons to that, but just wanted to get your experience with having an attorney actually negotiate the first contract for you.
Yeah. So starting with that point, our clients are about 50-50 on what they like to do. So, and I think it depends on organization and, if there's prior relationships there or not. But so we certainly do interface with organizations directly with either the chair or with legal, right? Depending on who they have handle the discussion. And I think for some personality types and for some organizations, that's helpful to remove yourself from it. But I also think there's value, especially on things like, the point that just got brought up of OR time, right? Or call, where that's very much a part of your day in and day out life and part of the lives of the colleagues that you're working with. And so if it's legal language, if it's comp and fair market value and justification on how we're getting to certain spots, I think that's really a great time to let an expert handle that. If it's things like I need to take less call because of X, or I need a block OR time, in the document, and it's really important for me for this reason, or I've got existing intellectual property that we need to carve out. I think there's a mix of both is really, really helpful. On the specific question on do we see unique things like block OR time in a contract? Occasionally we do. Most scope, duties and responsibility sections start out really, really broad, meaning the employer sets all of that at their discretion. But if you can get either mutual consent on that, or if you can get some type of a cap, right, on, clinic days to save that time for the OR, or capping call, right, is another thing that we've seen certain physicians need, right, and they have to, or they won't take the job. It doesn't mean that that's not going to result in less guaranteed salary, or there may be offsets for some of this stuff, but if it's a deal breaker for you, or the only reason you were applying for the job is because you thought that was possible, I think you have to solve it up front, because nobody wants an employee that's upset 18 months later. They've spent a lot of time, right, and a lot of investment in getting you to where you're at. So their goal is to keep you long term as well.
That's great. Thank you, Kyle.
Just from my perspective, I will add that if you're negotiating your first contract, either get an attorney who will help you, perhaps keep them in the background, and you be forward facing until things get really technical, or absolutely run it by a senior mentor or your former program director or someone, because they've looked at these contracts and they'll bring up some things that you want to know. But please use some sort of professional or someone who's done this before, and don't try and wing it yourself.
Absolutely.
A question for the panel, for those who are interested in academic track and, obviously setting the foundation for an academic career, what are your thoughts on how to negotiate for the right level of support early on? What kind of, how does that look from a dollar standpoint? Does that factor into your comp, or is that separate? How much time, protected time, should one ask for? Can they ask for? How much time should they be asking for as far as the necessary turnaround to getting independent funding? What are your thoughts on that?
I guess I could just provide a little bit of my own experience with that. So when I negotiated my first contract, I had talked to a mentor, and basically they recommended that you ask for a certain amount of money, basically in seed funds from the university, that they provide to you as essentially kind of starting out money. And it could be $100,000 up to $300,000, and that is negotiated in the contract. And most academic centers, I think, will provide you with some seed funds to kind of get you started, if that's one thing you want to do, things like basic science or things like that. But I think you have to, at least from my perspective, you have to really be honest with yourself about what you want to do, because a lot of serious research, like say for instance in a new grad, a K award or something like that, requires a pretty significant amount of your time. In fact, it's written into it that you cannot be 70% clinical and be applying for certain grants and stuff like that. So I think you just have to know yourself, know what your goals are, know what you can honestly produce, and where you want to spend your time, and have a good idea about that. And I think if an institution is looking for a certain mix of research and clinical work, I think if you match that place, I think it's great.
Yeah, I'll echo that as well. I think those positions are getting harder and harder to find, but also I think the number of people who would truly qualify initially as a surgeon scientist are very small. And but I think most departments actually with that bent will perhaps even open the door for something like that for you based on your CV. If you come out with an MD, PhD, etc., then I think you might have that door open for you. But as Derek said, you really need to know what you want to be doing in 5 years. Do you want to be running an NIH-funded lab, or do you want to be the surgeon? I guess you can be both, but it's becoming harder and harder.
Right. That's great. I'd like to address some of the questions in the chat box. The first one was already answered by Dr. Bora, but I'm going to ask for Kyle Afshin and maybe Derek's input. Can you comment on common productivity numbers in heart surgery? Goal for work RVU seems to about 10K, with production over 10K being about $70 per work RVU. Is that about right?
Well, from a licensing standpoint, I'm not supposed to give you the data in a discussion like this, but I can tell you that if you need to fact check it and verify it, you can go on our site, and it's fairly inexpensive. But if anybody else wants to talk that doesn't have licensing issues, I'd be happy to hear that.
I don't know, maybe Dr. Ehsan? You're on mute.
My personal experience professionally has never been, my comp has never been based on RVU. It's been a base salary within volume absolute numbers of cases tied to the bonus structure. So I've never had to personally negotiate based on RVU a value to each RVU.
But see, it does depend maybe on whether you're in a private or academic setting as well. Derek, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a little bit, I think, about but 10K maybe sounds a little bit more than what would be, I guess, considered normal for first contract, from what I think. I'm kind of going off of that STS compensation survey, and they show, you know, a lot of numbers in terms of, you know, based on region even, and that's a great thing to look at also. But I think the median was around like 7,000 or 8,000
Right.
on that for most places. The 50% are kind of middle of the area, and then the 90th percentile was somewhere like 18 or 19 or 20,000 RVUs, and then, you know, but the median sounded about 7 or 8, and then
Right.
$70 per RVU. That's probably a little better than I've experienced, but yeah,
Right.
somewhere around.
On the other side.
The only point I would make on that quickly is that the threshold is going to be very dependent on where your base is set. So I mean, if 10,000 is in your contract, it may be right if your base is high enough to get to that equivalent level, or it could be extremely out of line. So I think having the numbers is great, but I think you need to analyze your contract on that too.
Okay. Another question from anonymous attendee. If we want to hire a lawyer to help with going through these contracts, how should we go about doing so? What should we look for in these professionals? I think Kyle, you're very positioned to answer this question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm clearly biased on this, right? I think you should hire an attorney, but I do think you're going to want to be careful on who you hire. So just like physicians, attorneys specialize, and some specialize in this, right? This is what we do all day. But we're not obviously the only attorneys out there in the world that do this. So I would talk to a colleague. I would talk to your societies, your national programs. I mean, make sure you have somebody who's vetted, and that you trust, and make sure that they do healthcare employment law. I mean, that's those would be the biggest takeaways for you.
I see. Right. There's a thank you note from one of the other attendees that this is helpful. Haven't been taught this in residency or fellowship. Another question, is it common to have exact call schedule in a contract? The offers I have received are not that specific. Is this something we should ask to be added?
Some do and some don't. You know, some are very definitive on it. They'll list out X number of call days per month and or per year. Sometimes they'll cap it at a ratio, like I mentioned before, 1 in 4. Sometimes it says you'll take call as we tell you to take call. And so I think it just depends on your situation of how detailed you want to be on that and how much of a deal breaker you're going to make it. But certainly we've seen it happen, you know, both ways.
Can one say, for example, I cannot be on call every other weekend? If that's the case, you have to find a locum or alternative coverage, things of that nature?
That's the call cap idea, is that if your cap is 1 in 3 and they need 1 in 2 out of you, right, they need to go pick up a locum for that third weekend, right, to bring into the pool. Yeah.
If I want to negotiate, for example, regarding the non-compete, should I reach out to the chief, chair, or the legal contact who sent me the contract, or both? I mean, I guess it depends on the situation and the institution, but
Yeah, we always think you go back to whoever gave you the contract. So if it came from the chair, you go back to the chair. If it came from legal, you go back to legal. They'll decide internally. I mean, if they need to funnel it a different direction for an answer, but I think there's some procedure that you need to follow and just go back to the person making the offer.
I'll give my personal side here. I think it's, if you can, go back to the person who you have a personal relationship with, rather than just a legal person, because if you go to legal, you'll get a legal response. But if you're being recruited by the chair and you know the chair, I would try and build a relationship with the chair and see what you can get done and get the chair to do some work for you.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that. I don't know, Afshin or Derek, what are your thoughts?
Personally, I would echo what Faye said. Absolutely.
Last question in the chat box. What's the average attorney charges for reviewing or negotiating a contract? I mean, I guess, Kyle.
Yeah, I mean, our pricing is flat fee and it's transparent. It's on the website. So you can go to resolve.com and check that out. I mean, most of our clients are right around $1,000 to review a contract, but we have heard from, you know, others, you know, who've come to us later, right, or from a second time, that the pricing really varies. I mean, kind of from that $1,000 area to, I mean, we had one client tell us they paid $10,000 their first time. So I think it depends on where your attorney's at, what they're specializing in, what they're good at. So I think the range is fairly dramatic, or can be dramatic.
I guess other attorneys I've seen personally, they charge per the hour, right? I mean, it's not a flat fee per
Right.
se. Flat fee
Correct.
per hour, but you know.
Right.
Okay. Any last minute comments or questions before we get to the most important question that Dr. Bora asked Kyle? How come attorneys don't have non-competes in their we haven't forgot about that, Kyle.
Well, most of the lawyers are the ones that end up in Congress who write the rules, right? So I don't think it should be surprising. It's actually there's a lot of the or not academic, but physician associations that have come out with positions against non-competes, which is great. The ABA for lawyers did the same thing. And it says ethically we're not supposed to do that because it would disrupt the attorney-client privilege and relationship. And I think physicians would be smart to push as hard as they can on that same area.
All right, we're sure we'll have you on our side.
Yeah, that's right. I'm with you on this one. Yeah.
I have no doubt. I guess one last question we just asked before we wrap this up. How can you negotiate for APP support, basically PA or nurse practitioner, in clinic, the OR, or in your first job?
So many contracts will come out with a paragraph that talks about equipment and office and personnel, and it'll just say that they're going to provide you with reasonable support in those areas. If it's a situation where potentially you're the first one in, right, in your specialty, you're the only one there. We do see clients that'll come in and say, hey, to take this job, I have to have at least one APP. I have to have my own dedicated office space. I need to have, whatever it is, certain pieces of equipment sometimes. Those are unique spots, right? I mean, I think the default rule is that most institutions you're going to go into will have some, policies and procedures around this already. So I think it just depends on where you're going and what the role looks like. But you can get it in there. I mean, we have seen people do that.
Absolutely. I would to your point, I think it does depend on the setting, as you kind of alluded to. If you're going to a private job in a rural area, they would like to start a thoracic or a cardiac program. I think you have a lot of leverage compared to you going to an academic urban setting, for instance, where they already have their the crew of APP and what have you. So definitely something you can negotiate that. I think you definitely can negotiate that depending on the setting. It's 6:58. I think this was great. I saw many attendees. Some of them I know, and many of them are fellows or young attendings. I think we covered a lot of topics. I mean, you can spend hours on contract negotiations. We had many experts, and I'm happy, and I'm sorry that we had a surprise, I guess, guest. It was not meant to be. He's supposed to give be one of the main panelists on another webinar in June on early career success, but Dr. Bora was very well positioned to give his perspective from, I would say, like a senior level. Kyle, thanks so much. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you for being an advocate for physicians. Afshin and Derek as well, and Aviana for organizing this webinar. I think it was very successful with a good attendance. In respect for everybody's time, maybe going back to their families and their other lives. I would like to conclude this webinar, but thanks again for attending, asking questions, and contributing in different ways. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.